Okay, thanks everybody, and thank you, Professor Jake, for this wonderful series. I think this is our final session, right?
Yes, yes.
Coffee and tea and Charlie, and as I said, I'm two-fisting it today. I've got tea
Okay.
and Professor Jake's medicine. So I'm gonna let Jake take it away. Thank you, sir.
All right. Well, it's been wonderful. This is our 13th week, and we just have a little bit left. So basically, we ended off last time he kicked somebody out of Rocinante for their disagreement about basically the South and humanity. And so we are now at the end of the journey. And he's gonna kind of sum up what happens. And this is a really interesting philosophical part as to when a journey ends and yet you're still on the journey. And this is something I talk to my college students about, and some of them have had this experience as well, where they've gone on a prolonged trip and know that it really ended for them, and yet they're still on the trip. And so this happens to Steinbeck as well. So let's go. In the beginning of this record, I tried to explore the nature of journeys, how they are things in themselves, each one an individual and no two alike. I speculated with a kind of wonder on the strength of the individuality of journeys and stopped on the postulate that people don't take trips, trips take people. That discussion, however, did not go into the lifespan of journeys. This seems to be variable and unpredictable. Who has not known a journey to be over and dead before the traveler returns to their home? The reverse is also true, in that many a trip continues long after movement in time and space have ceased. I remember a man in Salinas who in his middle years traveled to Honolulu and back, and that journey continued for the rest of his life. We could watch him in his rocking chair on his front porch, his eyes squinted, half closed, endlessly traveling to Honolulu. My own journey started long before I left and was over before I returned. I know exactly where and when it was over, near Abingdon in the dog leg of Virginia. At 4 o'clock of a windy afternoon, without warning of goodbye or kiss of my foot, my journey went away and left me stranded far from home. I tried to call it back, to catch it up, but it was a foolish and hopeless matter because it was definitely and permanently over and finished. The road became an endless stone ribbon, the hills obstructions, the trees green blurs, the people simply moving figures with heads but no faces. All the food along the way tasted like soup, even the soup. My bed was unmade. I slipped into it for naps at long, uneven intervals. My stove was unlighted, and a loaf of bread gathered mold in my cupboard. The miles rolled under me unacknowledged. I know it was cold, but I didn't feel it. I know the countryside must have been beautiful, but I didn't see it. I bulldozed blindly through West Virginia, plunged into Pennsylvania, and grooved Rocinante to the great wide turnpike. There was no night, no day, no distance. I must have stopped to fill my gas tank, to walk and feed Charlie, to eat, to telephone, but I don't remember any of it. It is very strange. Up to Abingdon, Virginia, I can reel back the trip like film. I have almost total recall. Every face is there, every hill and tree and color and sound of speech and small scenes ready to replay themselves in my memory. But after Abingdon, nothing. The way was a gray, timeless, eventless tunnel, but at the end of it was the one shining reality. My own wife, my own house in my own street, and my own bed. It was all there, and I lumbered my way toward it. Rocinante could be fleet, but I had not driven her fast. And now she leaped under my heavy, relentless foot, and the wind shrieked around the corners of the house. If you think that I am indulging in fantasy about the trip, how can you explain that Charley knew it was over too? He at least is no dreamer, no coiner of moods. He went to sleep with his head in my lap, never looked out the window, never said "Pft," never urged me to a turnout. He carried out his functions like a sleepwalker, ignored whole rows of garbage cans. If that doesn't prove the truth of my statement, nothing can. Even Charlie's not interested in urinating anymore. Oh, now he's in New Jersey Turnpike, my beautiful polluted state. New Jersey was another turnpike. My body was in a nerveless, tireless vacuum. The increasing river of traffic from New York carried me along, and suddenly there was the welcoming maw of the Holland Tunnel, and at the other end, my home. A policeman waved me out of the snake of traffic and flagged me to a stop. You can't go through the tunnel with that butane, he said. But officer, it's turned off. Doesn't matter, it's the law. Can't take gas into the tunnel. And suddenly I fell apart, collapsed into a jelly of weariness. But I want to get home, I wailed. How am I going to get home? He was very kind to me and patient too. Maybe he had a home somewhere. You can go up and take the George Washington Bridge, or you can take a ferry. It was rush hour, but the gentle-hearted policeman must have seen a potential maniac in me. He held back the savage traffic and got me through and directed me with great care. I think he was strongly tempted to even drive me home. Magically, I was on the Hoboken ferry and then ashore, far downtown with the daily panic rush of commuters leaping and running and dodging in front, obeying no signals. Every evening is Pamplona in lower New York. So he's making a reference to the running of the bulls. I made a turn and then another, entered a one-way street the wrong way and had to come back out, got boxed in the middle of a crossing by a swirling rapids of turning people. Suddenly I pulled to the curb in a no parking area, cut my motor, and leaned back in the seat and laughed. And I couldn't stop. My hands and arms and shoulders were shaking with road jitters. An old-fashioned cop with a fine red face and a frosty blue eye leaned in toward me. What's the matter with you, Mac? You drunk? He asked. I said, officer, I've driven this thing all over the country. Mountains, plains, deserts, and now I'm back in my own town, where I live, and I'm lost. He grinned happily. Think nothing of it, Mac, he said. I got lost in Brooklyn only Saturday. Now, where is it you were wanting to go? And that's how the traveler came home again. So that's the end of the book. But there's an appendix that I wanted to read and share as well. So the end of the book is basically him getting lost in Midtown Manhattan traffic, getting boxed in, going down wrong one-way streets. And again, I think one of the themes of this book is that Steinbeck turns to jelly in traffic. So he just can't handle the traffic, and he just wants to go home. So, but here's the appendix. And this is important, and I think, again, the storm that we read at the very beginning of this is where the trip begins. It's before he ever gets into Rocinante, but there's a storm, and that storm, which is an actual hurricane, Donna, that actually happened, is also a metaphor for the storm of his life. He is getting a serious illness, and he is aware of that, and he will eventually die and succumb to that illness. He's getting older, and people are telling him to slow down. And this was a trip that he had to take for himself. And so this appendix is going to talk a little bit about these things. This narrative opened with a storm, the Hurricane Donna, far and away the greatest send-off an expedition ever had, and I thought at the time a little overboard. And by rights, it should end with a storm, and it did. But again, I am troubled by matters of proportion. My travels with Charley were a simple, almost humble undertaking. They caused no flurry and piled up a limited heap of information. Thinking back, I don't know what, if anything, I learned. Therefore, the storm at the end may seem a very big stage set for a very small drama. Of course, I could womp up a medium storm or a small earthquake in good taste and proper proportion, but in this account, I have clung tenaciously, perhaps foolishly, to the truth. The storm I must use is the only storm I have. My lady wife lowered the New York Times and gazed at me so long that I inspected any recent deeds and impulses. "You've been invited to the inauguration," she said. "You made the rule about no jokes in the morning. It says here you've been invited to the inauguration. By whom, for God's sakes? By the president. Who else? But I don't know him. What is this? 4 painters, 4 poets, and 4 novelists, and you're one of the novelists." Now remember, he said about this trip because of the election, right, between Kennedy and Nixon, and now he's being invited to the inauguration afterwards. "That's crazy," I said. "Everybody knows what the government thinks of artists. They're good for questioning about overcoming the government by force and violence. I'm not sure the invitation isn't unconstitutional. That new guy had better watch his step. Aren't Westerns good enough for him? Well, who does he think he is?" "Well, I've never seen an inauguration," she said. "Neither have I." And there we were. In one trait, I am predictable. I dislike being late. I arrive at the theater while they are sweeping out from the matinee. I haunt a ship hours before it has any intention of sailing. Reluctantly accepting a cocktail invitation, I usually arrive before my hostess is out of the bathtub. The historic snowstorm of the Kennedy inauguration caused endless trouble. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
No. Some heads of state were long late and some didn't get there at all. It was not so with us. We had arrived and were billeted in a lovely house in Georgetown and were having a tall, cool drink when the first snow fell, and we watched it flake by flake as it slowed and finally brought the whole city to a standstill, covered stalled cars with a soft white blanket. It may have inconvenienced some charging, bellowing officials, but for us, it made of Washington the most beautiful city in the world and a quiet place. In cities, the muffled undersound of motors is so constant that we consider it silence. When it is removed, the effect is startling and almost shocking. It was very well for us sitting comfortably watching through the window while the heavy businesslike flakes settled with every intention of remaining. And the depth built up. Every statue wore a tall white cap and every marble nose was tipped with a horn like that of a rhinoceros. The streets were tangles of abandoned cars and the sidewalks narrow paths between high shoveled walls. Men and women moved with high tiptoe leaps as though speed and posture might keep the snow from their shoes. I thought of the grand preparations, the hours of ladies in beauty parlors, the hundreds of thousands of new and delicate ball gowns, the spiked heeled satin shoes a passing out might sully. What despair there must be in thousands of feminine breasts. It is true the inauguration concerned only one man who by one short oath would renounce the world he knew and could never regain it. But it is also true that if the last judgment were announced, the first and proper thought of all ladies would be, what shall I wear? And while Steinbeck is showing a little bit of himself here,
Yeah.
And while the archangels are preparing the courtroom and the blessed tune their harps and certain others lie hunching under their fires, the ladies will be dashing hysterically in and out of fitting rooms. And then as the snow piled deeper and deeper and movement became impossible and then ridiculous, people changed. A kind of hell for leather gaiety invaded the city. Has anybody ever heard that term before? Hell for
Yeah.
leather?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Tragedy became a holiday. Even Republicans who had seen in the weather divine wrath at a Democratic victory began to have fun. Our blessings held. The cocktail parties to which we were assigned were all in easy walking distance. The morning was like the Christmas song where the snow lay all about, deep and soft and even, and the sun turned it glittering. In the night, the army had been out plowing the main thoroughfares, and true to form, I got us to our seats below the rostrum at the Capitol long before the ceremony, so long before that we nearly froze. Mark Twain defined women as lovely creatures with a backache. I wonder how he omitted the only other safe generality, goddesses with cold feet. A warm-footed woman would be a monstrosity. I think I was the only man there who heard the inauguration while holding his wife's feet in his lap, rubbing vigorously. With every sentence of the interminable prayers, I rubbed, and the prayers were interesting if long. One sounded like general orders to the deity issued in a parade ground voice. One prayer brought God up to date on current events with a view to their revision. In the midst of one prayer, smoke issued from the lectern, and I thought we had gone too far, but it turned out to be a short circuit. How startling then to hear the simple, stark oath of office offered and accepted. How moving, how deeply moving. I had never seen the ceremony before, and it was good, and I was glad. Only one episode remains to be told, and then my travels with Charley are finished. And we have never admitted this scene, although we haven't out and out lied about it. Remember when you have visited some foreign area and some other traveler has asked, quote, "Did you see such and such?" If you say no, he screams, "What? Why, that was the best. Don't see why you went at all if you didn't see such and such." We have learned to reply to the question, "Wonderful" or "remarkable." That doesn't say we did or didn't see it, and it saves us from argument. Well, we were invited to the inaugural ball, the biggest and most desirable one where thousands of people would gather, where all the new dresses and satin shoes and hairdos would be. In the house of our hostess, other guests were ready, fingers moving restlessly in filmy cloth or tucking in hair that had never escaped, and every mirror was a place for sidelong glances. Dress ties were patted reassuringly every few seconds. The radio said that traffic conditions were impossible. Mobs of people, beautifully dressed, were floundering through snowdrifts, and the great black official cars chugged through streets clanking chains. We drank together a last glass of champagne, and then everyone was gone, and the house was quiet, and the low lights were soft, and the room a cushion of warm comfort. It was automatic. We didn't plan it. We drank another glass of wine looking out at the mountains of snow, and then we crept up to our room and put on dressing gowns. In the kitchen, we made sandwiches and arranged trays. Then I stood the great and important tickets of invitation to the ball on top of the television and turned on the set. We saw the president and his lady right up close, and we saw the packed thousands below in crushed and snow-dabbled ball gowns. We nibbled our sandwiches and had a tall drink. And afterwards, when we were asked how we liked the inaugural ball, we said, "Loved it, remarkable, wonderful." And so it was. And we saw much more of it than the ones who were actually there. I guess it was the best ball I was ever invited to, and I enjoyed it the most too. And in the morning, the snow was past, and so was the journey. I do know this: the big and mysterious America is bigger than I thought, and more mysterious. So that is the appendix, the end of the book. So I would like to get some reactions as to the ending, your overall reaction to the book. And, you know, I think to Steinbeck's kind of even at the end, he says, he's still not sure what he learned. Other than that, America is big, which it is. If you ever drive across America, it's big and it's mysterious. There's a lot to America, and I think we rarely penetrate its depth because we're so used to arguing about its surface. But there's so much depth to America that gets overlooked because of our divisive ideologies and politics. But I think the most beautiful part was when he was talking to people and trying to discover, and also when he was outside in nature. Anytime he was stressed out from traffic that night, him and Charley would park along a river or a stream or a creek, and they would go out and look at the stars and look at the moon, and all of a sudden his mood would change. And I think Steinbeck was pretty prophetic about the whole environmental crisis. And I think he began to see how reassuring our environment could be to our state of mind and our psyche. Because the moment that he became lost in the monstrosity of traffic and human development, he could always go to nature to recenter himself. And then the next morning he was calmed and he would go back into the world. But again, I want to open it up for just, overall comments, thoughts about the ending and about the whole book. Oh, Alan's not there, is he, in the studio to hand out the microphone?
I am here virtually, and I
just scream at me. It's all right.
I think there is a mic floating around in the theater somewhere.
Anybody have a mic?
I wish I had my laptop.
Oh, is somebody looking? Nope. Oh, we lost somebody. Well, I think was she going to find somebody to get the mic? Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Here she comes.
Okay.
Good.
No.
I thought I saw Lance moving around with the microphone.
No.
No.
Are we on now?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
We're back on.
Good, we got some people. Here, Molly. I'm gonna shut my mouth.
Go ahead. I can hear you.
Did I interrupt anyone else that was speaking?
No, you're good.
Okay, there were just two things that really stood out to me is his humanness, really humanness, and that beautiful way he has of expressing it. And so you have that gift. The other thing that struck me. Okay, all right. I'm glad it's back. The other thing that struck me was when you said before the end of the book, I don't know if I learned anything. Well, it seemed like we were learning the whole time through the whole. And why would he say that there in the book that he would? I mean, I know you addressed it a little bit, but that kind of surprised me because he was learning the whole way, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The whole journey, I mean, we read this whole book together, right? And we saw how many different topics he actually tackled. An amazing amount of topics that he went into, plus all these asides that he went into. So I think at the time that he finished the book, he was still unsure of what he learned. But the thing is, as readers, reading the book, especially in segments, we're able to kind of digest what he put out to us in our own way. Whereas he's still, I think, looking for a big take. We can see all the little takes. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
And because we read it part and parcel, we were really able to digest and have conversations about little things, which after each little thing, we realize we're learning something and all these little things begin to add up. Whereas to him, because I think he wrote the book, he's still looking for this big thing that he can leave the reader with, maybe totally unaware of how many little things that he already left us with. And I think sometimes as a writer, because you wrote it and you went through it, you're not aware of all the little things that the reader has already garnered from reading the book. But I think as a writer too, sometimes, or as even a thinker, philosopher, whatever, you want to be like, okay, I went on this trip for almost 4 months, this whole undertaking. What did I learn from it? And I think in that respect, he might not have one thing that he can dole out that he learned. And I think that's what he's talking about. But I think overall, he probably changed a lot from going on that trip and came back home as a pretty different person who had a much different understanding of America than he did when he had traveled in the 1920s, which was a totally different time than the 1960s. And the 1960s, even though there's a lot of things like that are similar and prophetic, if you drop Steinbeck down in our world right now, it would be a major shock. I mean, you know, technology, people arguing politically, probably not much of a shock to him, but the technological pace that the world has evolved at would totally shock him, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
You want to go ahead, Mary?
I just think that the book emphasized for me that the urban-rural divide is greater than ever. And well, Bob and I took a number of road trips. The emptying out of a large part of the landmass of the country is what one of the things we took away from our travels. And the other thing I feel is that people on the Eastern Seaboard, and we have family there, so I mean, I speak from experience with them, are very Eastern centric and unaware in some ways of the geography, the space, the expanse of the rest of the country. And I think that comes through in his reactions. Well, he's from the West, but his interactions with people and his reactions to things are, Easterners need to travel more. They need to see more of the country. And Washington, D.C. shouldn't be on the East Coast. It should be in the middle of the country. I just think that that's a lot of the divide in the country is ignorance of large parts of it.
Yeah, you know, I mean, one of the reasons I've made, besides world religion, placial studies my life is because I think place has a huge effect on us. Where we come from, what we've seen, what we haven't seen, what we believe about places that is myth and not reality. And when you start to travel more, and not everybody has the time or the money to travel, and that's true. But when you do start to see more places, you start to see your regional naivete, your regional inclinations, your regional prejudices. And a lot of people might never go beyond that because they don't ever go outside their region. And America's a big place. I think that's another thing that like it surprised him again, how big it is. And to get across America, I mean, Australia is even bigger, but to get across America, you know, you need to drive a great deal, and you're going to pass through a lot of different landscapes. It's absolutely can be beautiful too, but you're going to also pass through a lot of different mindsets, a lot of different ideologies, a lot of different ways of thinking about reality. And we have this one place called America, but there's so many different mindsets, ideologies, regional narratives within America that it's hard. It's a very difficult place to make any sense of. Like when I would live nomadically and people would say, oh, describe America to me, I'd say, I can't. I absolutely cannot describe America to you. I can, and even if you say describe Seattle, like somebody said to you, describe Seattle, you're really going to describe the Seattle that is your reality, your neighborhood, And if somebody lives in a different neighborhood or a different part of Seattle, your Seattle might not sound anything like their Seattle. And so the placial studies to me is fascinating. And then places change so much too. If you remember when Steinbeck was driving through Seattle, he couldn't make any sense of it whatsoever. It just seemed like and he said, it didn't even seem like a different, like that it had become a different place, but that it was a whole totally new place. Now, if you took somebody living in Seattle in 1960 and put them in Seattle now, it would probably be a very similar thing, that it wasn't even that Seattle became something different, but that it was a whole new place. So, placial studies is something that didn't really come about. When I did my master's thesis in 2001, I had hardly any books that I could turn to that were part of that field. And now it's blossomed. There's a lot of books on placial studies. There's a lot of references and resources for people. And I think that's because people are starting to look more deeply into how place shapes their lives. So I'd like to hear about that too, because this book is very much about placial studies, because he's going through different places, he's getting different attitudes. So how does place affect your life? That's kind of one of the overarching themes of this book and why I use it in my university courses.
I think place affects people a lot, but I think we need to even go deeper in terms of the European and the different cultures that settled here years ago. In the South, you have the blacks coming from Africa, and you have the Irish and the Scottish and Appalachia, and then you have the Northern Europeans in the East Coast. You have the Scandinavians in Seattle and the Midwest, and California is now known as North Mexico. I mean, I heard that term when we were down there, and just the different parts of the United States where people from different countries settled, and I think that has also has influenced us in terms of feeling our place. And I just thought of that, but I think it's true. A lot of it, it's changed. So many people are moving around now, so but I think initially that might have been one of the reasons that we are different in different parts of the United States.
Yeah, and that's part of placial studies too, is bioregions and ethnic regions. It's getting more opaque now because so many people are moving and migrating. But when people originally came over, they did settle into areas that made them feel comfortable and safe around their own people, their own cultures and traditions. I mean, so I grew up in northern New Jersey, where every town was basically a different nationality: Polish, German, Irish, Northern Italian, Southern Italian, Sicilian. And then New York City was also pockets of different. There was Yugoslavian parts, there was, Russian parts, Chinese, so they were all, now things are more blending because so many more people are shifting from different parts of the world. But of course, I would say in placial studies, looking at that, especially from like 1920 to like 1950, how there were pockets of cultures throughout the country. But now it's a totally different animal now, with the amount of movement and migration that's happening. It's much harder to put a sense of that, because places that used to be Irish are now Guatemalan. Places that used to be German are now, it's totally changed over the years. And so, I think that's a very important point to still look at, but it's getting harder to look at because so many people are moving so rapidly. That's a great point, though. Any other thoughts?
What do you think is the place that he liked the best in his travels? What I remember was Montana.
Yeah, I loved Montana.
That is what he says, yes. And we'll have to go by his own words, was that he had a love affair and has continued to have a love affair with Montana. Yeah. And I think that's interesting because in Montana, he found space. And I think he was kind of looking for space. You know, anytime he's in a congested city, he feels out of place, like a fish out of water. But anytime he feels he's moving into like a place where he has space, because I think this was an important time in his life, and his wife thinks this too, because he had reached the height of his fame earlier, right? When he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he was going to end his life as a writer, but he had reached his pinnacle and now was kind of becoming less important as a writer to America. Things were changing. He was getting older. He was having health difficulties. And I think he needed this trip, but more than anything, I think he needed a space. And so coming into places like Montana, it provided him with the physical space, allowed him to have the mental space to kind of contemplate his life at that moment, which I think a lot of this was about. It was about two things. It was about finding America, but also finding out where he was in his life too. Because fame can take you away from your life and make you into a caricature of sorts. And because nobody recognized him, and because he wasn't around people who would think of him as a famous person, he got to breathe as just a human being, you know, just a guy traveling. And I think he needed that at that moment. And I think Montana probably, maybe more than other crowded places, provided him with that psychological room because it was physically roomy. I could be totally wrong about that too. Because I mean, when you've traveled, I mean, all of you weren't born at, you know, in Green Lake. So you've lived in different places, or maybe you were on a raft, but you know, you've lived in different places, and I would expect that you would have felt differently in different places that you've lived in, because they spoke to different parts of yourself. Some might have been more freeing, some might have been inhibiting, because you and the place kind of do this dance with each other. And sometimes, you know, it's a beautiful waltz, and sometimes, you know, you're just breakdancing and breaking yourself. So, you know, place is a very deep thing that a lot of times is not explored. I know in academic circles, it's only been, you know, the last decade where it's even begun to be explored in the classroom. So does any of you have a place that you remember journeying to that brought out a side of yourself that was really invigorated? But do you also have a memory of a place that you lived in that kind of, I don't know, made you feel disconnected? Because we can see that in Steinbeck in this trip. I mean, he'll go from feeling totally disconnected in a morning to feeling totally connected by late afternoon. And that's what happened to him in the Black Hills of South Dakota. If you remember, he said it was the only place at night that he had ever experienced where he felt much more calm and peaceful and light at night than he did during the day.
Yeah, remember that section.
Yeah, which is a really deep statement about the impact of place on a person, because seeing it in the light made him feel uncomfortable. But at night, when the darkness settled in, he didn't have the vision to look out. He felt much more comfortable.
Trying to think.
I would even say if you just take the place that you live in, the Hearthstone, right? Are there, it's kind of, you know, there's multi-levels, there's different places, and I know you can't all gather like you used to, but aren't there places in the Hearthstone where you feel you walk into and maybe it feels much more comfortable, much more light, you feel invigorated, and there's other places, other rooms where you don't feel that same sense. I remember when I was doing in-person there, I gave a talk on the power of place. And people would say, yeah, there's this one room that I go to sit and read that looks out over the lake, and I love that place. And then there's this other place that I go to sometimes, and I meet with people, and it's much darker, and I just feel like I don't feel as, you know, I don't feel as at home. So even in your own Hearthstone, are there places that you return to time and time again, like rooms or common areas that you really like, and other places that you simply, even though you've lived there for 10 years, might never actually go to on your own?
Well, we used to.
Right, I know.
I think the dining room for many of us was the place that we gathered and saw people a few times a day, but we didn't otherwise. We that way.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I taught this Travels with Charley class the first time, we didn't get all the way through because then COVID hit. But we were in a room on the top floor that like looked out onto the city. You know, it was all windows, and I just, man, I used to love driving. I lived in Redmond. I used to love driving over and then going up to that room. I used to arrive like 20 minutes early just to kind of meditate there before people would arrive, because it was such a beautiful place. And when people would walk up to that place, they would be like, oh, I love coming to this room, you know, like I love being up here. And that's a place, you know, they used to look forward to that hour and a half that we had together because we were journeying together, but also just being in that room made them feel, you know, good.
For me, it's the library. I'm relatively new here. I've only been here a year and a half, which isn't really new, but I just find myself up there just surrounded by books. I miss all my books that I had to leave behind, and just sitting in a comfortable chair and not even reading, just kind of looking at the books. It's a comforting place for me.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's interesting. I in Florida, I was brought in, there was a couple of senior residences that were run by the Presbyterian Church. I'm not Presbyterian, but they would bring me in, and I worked as kind of a spiritual formation. I was kind of the alternative chaplain for people who were interested in not only Christianity, but other religions, and who just wanted to go deeper into their spirituality. But one of the things is they would bring anybody who was new, who was having a hard time, you know, being in that place, because they would be moved, or their spouse had died, or their children had moved them. So anybody who was having a difficult time, they would bring them to my group. And my group was about anywhere between 8 to 14 people every week. It was a spiritual formation group, but when they brought a new person, we would try to help them get acclimated, because it's very important, right, to get, this is going to be their home. And so the thing that I would tell the person is, you know, this is a big complex, especially in Florida. A lot of them were on lakes. They were pretty big. And I would say, what I'd like you to try to do in the first couple of weeks that you're here is to find one place, and you just enunciated this with the library. Find one place. It could be a bench by the little dock outside. It could be an area that you sit in outside under the bougainvilleas. It could be the library. They had all sorts of different sitting rooms, but I just want you to find one place here and go back to it every day and try to establish a relationship with it. Because if you can do that, then you'll feel at home, at least there. And then after that, try to find another place. And it was an interesting way to try to ground them into where they were, because they had been moved from a place that most of them had felt was their home. And now they were in this new place. And it was a process of getting them. And then once they were good, they could kind of then go back into the community. But it was interesting that they would keep bringing new people to our group. And then we would keep trying to help them to become, and the term is emplaced. Because when you feel out of place, or you feel like a fish out of water, that's a very serious thing.
Well, we have not been able to really be part of the big building because of the lockdown. But when we moved here, I anticipated that Green Lake, the park itself, would be my place. But it's the neighborhood that's become the place where I choose to walk and follow people's gardens and follow the decorations through the course of the year. We lived in this area many, many years ago, 50 years ago, Bob. And I feel like I'm becoming reacquainted with something from my past. And that's been the most comfortable place here for me.
And that's interesting, is that it's different, because you probably thought Green Lake, natural, I'll go there. And yet you've been walking through human habitation.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's intuitive, right? Like, even though the one you might have thought, what's actually happened has been different. Yeah. Other thoughts out there?
I thought it was interesting when he went back to the place where he had grown up. And he had changed, of course. And so had the area, but he wasn't comfortable there at all.
Yeah, that's a great thing. I mean, it's a great point, because that was kind of, and a lot of his trip was really looking forward to getting back to Monterey and Salinas, where he grew up. And yet you're right, when he got there, he had changed, the place had changed, but some of the people had stayed the same. And so they looked at him as an interloper, and they needed him to leave to get back to the place that they knew. Because as long as he was there, they couldn't be comfortable, especially in Johnny Gallego's bar. They needed him to leave that bar to get back to just sitting at that bar. Yeah, that's a very good point. And there's a lot of things that say you can't go home again, because the home that you imagine doesn't really exist anymore except in your memory. And everybody will have a different memory of what that home was. And yet the people who live there now might have no memory of the place that you lived in.
Plus, over the years, you've embellished that memory in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other comments? Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, I feel this book is just, I mean, this is probably the 20th time I've taught and read the whole book to classes outside of the times I read it on my own. And it's just, there's always a lot of discussions that come from this book, because there's so many things in his personal life that other people go through. There's so many things in the life of America that are still happening now, that were happening then, that are even more serious now, that have become bigger issues as far as, just people getting along, political division, environment degradation. I mean, all these things are still going on. And so it's 60 years ago, and a lot of books that they ask you to read in college and school, they don't hold up. I mean, they just don't hold up when you read them, but this book does. It holds up. And a lot of my young students love this book, and see a lot of prophetic things in it, and wonder why some of them have never been addressed. But it's interesting.
Well, how are we going to choose our next book? Should we send ideas?
Yes, please.
Okay.
We'll see.
The end of the paperback edition has a list of books: On the Road, The Devil's Highway, Blue Highways, Go Greyhound. Well, we just maybe send you ideas, Alan, and go
Yeah,
from there.
please do. And we'll see, if there are one-offs or if there's a series that Jake wants to do for us again. That would be wonderful. And I've enjoyed the journey. It's not one I took entirely this time. I read the book a long time ago, and I was catching up. A friend actually had done a book discussion on it in the Chicago area. And it was shocking to her how much, this was back in 2016. It was shocking to her how many of the issues, migrant issues and so forth, were bubbling up to the surface that were very similar to today. So it is, I think there's there's a lot to this little book. And I'm glad you took us on this journey, and that we are able to share it with those that are not able to make it. I know that people have dinner with Travels with Charley. People have breakfast with Travels with Charley. So it's been a great trip. And please, I know you're busy where you are, but let's be in touch about future programs virtually. I think that this model can work.
Yeah. And I mean, unfortunately, with things being the way they are, it seems like at least this model, I don't know, even the seminary where I'm teaching and where I'm at, working on my book, they don't know if we're even going to be in class anymore within the next month, or going virtual again. So we have to find ways to keep connecting with each other in intimate ways so that people's spirits stay up. It's very important not to just, not have any kind of social interaction or intellectual stimulation. So.
And Jake, do you have any ideas for another book? You said not William Lee Seat Moon, but
Yeah, I mean, I have some ideas. I think it has to be a book that's accessible to people, that takes us on some kind of a journey that we can get interested in together, but also that addresses issues that are relevant. So I try to pick books with all three of those kind of, so that it can engage us on multiple levels. I think if you're going to have a book for groups of people and we have to have discussion, it has to be a multi-leveled and multi-layered book. So yeah, I'll continue to think about that. Yeah.
And any
But-
suggestions, send them my way.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody. You know, I mean, it takes dedication and discipline to show up. And I think that alone is a wonderful thing to be able to do, to consistently show up and for each other too, right? Because that's what I try to instill in people. Like when you show up to this, you show up not only for yourself, but for each other so that we can do this together. And if you don't show up, it falls apart. So you need dedicated people to come back. And that alone is a real, I think, kind of, it's a wonderful thing to have within you. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for a wonderful journey.
So much.
All right.
It's been great, great journey.
Yeah, really great. Looking forward to the next group. And
Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
thank
Absolutely.
you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Here.
Yeah, happy
Get
New Year.
well, Alan.
Thank
Peace be
you.
with
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.